Okay, well, welcome again. Great to see you. Don't worry. And yeah, as Paolo said, I'm going to just explain a bit. It's pretty much what you have in the beginning of the program. So you might look at pages 4 and 5. And as you know, in recent decades, the conceptions, strategies, and implications of literary translation have been promoted to the rank of first-order philosophical and cultural problems. The explosive multiplication of transfers between territories and cultures, on the one hand, and the doubt that has been cast over the transparency claimed for the communication of meaning and the universality of representation, on the other hand, have created a growing awareness of the importance and of the difficulties and solutions of translation, where poetic versions have always been seen as the extreme case. Amidst these developments, the epistemological, ethical, historiographical, and even utopian outputs that arise in the difficulties of passage between languages, but also in the trouvailles that have been devised to cope with these difficulties, have been extended to other systems of science and treated as keys to understanding the communication as well as the foundation of languages, cultures, institutions, and even experience as such. Thus, the 4 lines of research and several individual topics that have been articulated in the program we are meant to develop over the next 2 weeks. This is what you have in pages 4 to 5 of the booklet. And it's important maybe to understand for those of you that have participated or been engaged less actively during the last 10 years on building this program that was built in collaboration. As you see in the first moment, and I'm reading now from the program, in the first moment, which will take the first few sessions today, we will address the more immediate interrogations raised by the semantic, the poetic, and epistemological challenges that define the task of the translation in strict terms, limits and possibilities of passage between languages and literature, before exploring the projections towards the realms of art and culture. These initial moments should allow us to engage with the different ways of understanding and practicing translation, establishing from the start alternative models to explore and develop the series of ethic, political, historiographical, and utopian interrogations to follow. In the second moment, which will take sessions 5 to 9, the rest of the week, this first week, we will concentrate on a series of ethical political interrogations that unfold the ways the model of translation allows one to rethink the relations between what we continue to call the native and the foreign. Special emphasis will be put on colonial and imperial practices, the translation of the victorious or the violence of translation, as well as on translation as both limited hospitality, hosting the foreign for the benefit of the own, boycott as indirect hospitality, and unconditional hospitality, right of asylum. In a third moment, at the beginning of next week, which will take sessions 10 to 14, which diachronizes the previous series of interrogations about the relation between the native and the foreign, we will address translation as a way of giving hospitality to the foreign in time, opening a series of historiographical interrogations. Amid the translative performances of historical renewal, special emphasis will be given to the afterlife of the missing and missed, memorialization of colonial, apartheid, and dictatorship unsettled dead, as well as the translative ways of shaping forms of layered memory, heterogeneous, multilingual, competing and contesting paths. In the fourth and final moment, the end of next week, sessions 15 to 19, we will interrogate the final promise inscribed in translation as both synchronic and diachronic hospitality as examined in the previous sessions, or what can be called the utopic output of translative language as a way of redefining the foundations of the social and the political. Special emphasis will be put on how human kinship as translation and contagion between languages and cultures, something that questions and detaches itself from the models of universality and genealogy, which have defined modern dominant modes of socio-political foundation, can become a new way of conceiving the constitution of the subject and the community in the so-called globalized world. So that's pretty much the program. As many of you know, because they participated actively on this program was built over, it was presented first from us here in Chile like a year and a half ago, but then it was completed, shaped, reformed by the many topics and interventions from the different centers. And it took this was an idea brought forward by Leroy Moore, that unfortunately is not here, but she's having a baby, so she might be very happy. Leroy Moore proposed to us in a pre-meeting more than a year ago that we should put a live Google document and actively participate in it. And there were some people of each centers that were in charge of this. And this is the program. The way that it's now is the way that it came out from a collaborative work over time. And that also explains why, because this 4 moments built on one another. I mean, it's necessary first to understand what is translation properly before trying to use the model of translation to think some pending questions in the realm of philosophy, culture, and others. So that explains why you will see some people repeating themselves in parts of the program. So you see, there are some people that are going to speak twice today, for instance, because they are more into the actual poetics of translation. Other people might speak a lot by the end of the week, because they have concentrated their participation in the more ethical or political subjects. So that explains, it's not that we were not aware that they were repeating in the same days, but the idea is to develop this program linearly, so to build one moment of another. So, I mean, what is translation properly in the first moment? How this extends to the relations between the cultures, the foreign and the native, how this diachronizes into an historiographical, where the difference of languages becomes a difference in time also. I mean, the idea of relating to the alterity of the past, and how this hospitality in time and place in the end project a sort of utopian language, a kind of a mixed language that is a new way of rethinking the foundations of institutions, culture, etc. So that's what we need to do. If I were to finish in a more rhetorical way before starting, I would just say that most of this outputs of translation can be summarized in the famous, you all know it, in the famous motive of the broken vessels of Walter Benjamin. Broken vessels that, as you recall, he uses to understand the relations of language as fragments. You know that the broken of a vessel is a symbol of the impossibility of appropriation, as the pieces that are given in a wedding, and that you renounce to the possession of the person being wed. So it's a symbol of limit, but it's also a symbol of hospitality, the broken symbol of the Greeks. The idea that you have a piece of the symbol that allows you to be recognized and you have certain rights of arrival. It's also a symbol of historiographical rescue, like when the broken vessel in Lurianic Kabbalah symbolizes the idea of redeeming the past. And finally, the Shevirat HaKelim in the same Lurianic Kabbalah, a symbol of exile and displacement in the whole cosmos or universe. So in a way, this is a very rhetorical way of summarizing some of the implications of the program, but also it's a way of also opening the program in this symbolic way to tell you that we expect here not only that you develop what you have said you're going to develop, but that you bring your own methodologies. I mean, the idea is not only at this stage that we are going to learn from each other for what we say, but also the way we work. So really feel free to work in the way you normally work. That's where we're going to really learn from you, also from what you say. But I mean, don't feel that this is not a conference in established. It doesn't have one methodology. The idea is that we bring as many methodologies as we like. Okay, that's all for the presentation. We're going to start now the first session. Matthew is in charge. Unfortunately, I'm going to speak almost immediately.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Matthew. I'm moderating this session, and also speaking in it. So there's going to be a strange divided self moment in which I have to impose a time limit on my own talk. Are we going to? But we'll see how that goes. There are 5. I'm going to introduce everyone because you can see who everyone is from the program and what we're talking about. So there are 5 talks. The way we thought we might over 2 hours. So the way we thought we might divide that is Andres and I would do our talks, and then there'll be a little kind of pause for questions about that, and then the talks that come after that by Adriana, Kaja, and Patrick, which all have a kind of coherence in that they're focusing on poetry and ways of translating or untranslating or not translating or partially translating or plurally translating poetry. We might hear them together and have questions about them together, and then a big discussion at the end. Also because Andres' talk and mine are sort of conceived I mean, we don't know what each other is going to say, but we've been chatting about things a bit in the past, so they're conceived as a kind of challenge each to the other, maybe, or something like that. They're conceived as a little bit of a binary. So we'll hear Andres and then me, and then have a little break for questions after that. Andres.
Okay, yeah, as Matthew said, we're going to do two talks that are related to one another. I mean, in a way, I'm going to establish strong limits that cannot be passed between language, as he's going to question that we can find that limit. So I think it should play well together. Well, I'm going to speak about transcendental limits between language. I hope you have a little handout there. I'm not going to use all of it, so don't worry. And I'll start immediately. Echoing the famously unforgiving Italian adage, which represents the unbridgeable gulf between language precisely as a lapsus linguae, Freud wrote the following, is what you have, quote, 1 there in the handout. A striking example of this jokes by alteration is the well-known exclamation traduttore traditore. The similarity between the two words, amounting almost to identity, very impressively conveys how the translator is always doomed to betray his author. The fateful nature of the betrayal seems to derive first of all from a conflict of loyalties. But caught in the no man's lands between two masters, in this double bind between languages, there is no help but for that to translate. He must translate. Thus would be the seeming, and I insist in this word, seeming paradox, that is the beginning and the foundation of the poetic translator's task. What Goethe summarized as, quote, 3, the contradiction between inherent impossibility and its absolute necessity. I say, and I insist, it's a seeming paradox, since one might invalidate it, disarticulate it, by asking a dual question. In the first place, what is it that fails or is betrayed in translating? So what is the impossible? And secondly, what is it that is translated in this betrayal, so the necessary? Answering the first of these questions for the time being, namely why the translator should be condemned to renunciation, limits, and impossibility, means coming to terms with the old traditional conceptions of what is or ought to be a successful translation. Conceptions that had usually treated as a transferal, imitation, or equivalence of meaning, and where among the typical figurations, metaphors, we find some like sailing between two shores, painting a model, or paying a debt. Let us stick just to the representation of translation as the conveying of meaning between two shores, the transportation of meaning, since it seems to be the very promise inscribed in the word translation, passing over, transferal, conveying to the other shore. Such is the case not only for the Latin traducere and translatio, on which the Spanish and the English words are formed, but also with the German übersetzen, which is a calque of the same etymology. As Jacob Grimm writes, quote 4, the task of translation is explained by the very word that expresses it, albeit with a change of accent. Übersetzen is übersetzen. To translate is to convey to the other shore, traducere navem. And indeed, anyone prepared to sail a boat with spread canvas to the further shore must disembark at a place where there is a different soil and another air. If translation is represented traditionally as a voyage between the shores of two languages, the key point is that the near unanimity in traditional positions, or the assumption that in the contract of carriage, what has to be ensured first and against all the vicissitudes of navigation is the meaning. Thus, already the humanist Pierre Daniel Hewitt in the 17th century, comparing translation to a boat overtaken by stormy weather, recommends that in the face of imminent shipwreck, the least valuable items be thrown overboard first. Elegance, rhythm, color, and ornament. In short, whatever I'm quoting is good only for pleasure. Then, if necessary, the captain must dispose of more valuable merchandise, naturalness and clarity, ultimately keeping only what is indispensable to sustain life, that is, the thoughts, the ideas, identified to the whole meaning. This basic figuration of the old dominant conception of translation is underpinned by a number of assumptions. In the first place, that it is possible to delimit and possess the meaning of an original text. In the second place, that this meaning is an unchanging cargo able to be molded to new recipients, that is, that the meaning is independent of the form containing it. Third, that this meaning can travel, be transported from one tongue to another, poured from one receptacle to another. Fourth, that translation is the carriage, conveyance, crossing, or trading of this meaning. And fifth, that there is a sea, a continuous medium of passage over which semantic integrity could be conveyed from the shore of one language to another. Less metaphorically, in the realm of semantics, these traditional positions appear to be sustained by at least two further interrelated realist suppositions. In the first place, that there exists a unity of human thought, and in the second, that meaning, including the objective representation of the world, transcends language. Now, these fundamental assumptions began to be seriously questioned, a questioning that has intensified in contemporary philosophy and sciences of language. I said it started to be questioned in the light of the Romantic, and especially von Humboldt's application of the Kantian Copernican revolution to language. A first conception of Humboldt's that is decisive for a problem of translating the meaning is the inseparability of language, thought, and representation of the world. Humboldt begins, quote 5, "Language is the organ that forms thought. Thought without language is quite simply impossible." Linguistic form would be inseparable from the content of thought. No clear and distinct idea could be contemplated by a wordless inner perception. Then Humboldt also conceives it as the sphere of objectivation for sense impressions. He writes, quote 6, "Language does not act by setting out from objects that are already fully perceived, for without language there would be no objects as such before the mind. Man lives with objects as language presents them to him." So, if the content and the form of language are indissolubly linked, the translator's contract of semantic carriage could only be fully discharged if the forms of language were universal. But Humboldt does not believe this to be the case. From this arises a second conception that is fundamental to the question before us. He adds, quote 7, "Thinking does not depend merely on language in general, but, to some degree, on each particular language too. A very substantial part of the content of each language so indisputably depends on this, that the form of linguistic expression can no longer be considered a matter of indifference for the content. If each language has an inner form and character of its own, producing a particular delimitation and synthesis at the phenomenon and ideal levels, then it configures a worldview that is different from and incommensurable with others." The implications of this disparity between tongues for the promised transferal of meaning will already have become apparent. Humboldt himself stated emphatically in a letter to Schlegel, he admits, quote 9, "All translation seems to me simply an attempt to accomplish the impossible." The fact is that the incommensurability between different tongues and between the corresponding semantic experience to which they give rise would seem to rule out any specularity or equivalence. There are differences at every level in lexical systems affecting discrete objectivation and the networks of signification, in grammatical systems affecting categorization and the ways events are presented in thought, including time conceptions, in phonetic systems affecting the iconicity of sound, the contributions of sound to sense, in figural habits affecting the ways of conceptualizing and projecting topologies at different levels, in contextual effects affecting webs of meaning that appeal to expectations in a culture, and in textual systems affecting, among others, the way history, in the double sense of the word history, is told. The end result of all these differences being that the transferal of a stable meaning would be, for the time being, impossible, even if we confine ourselves to the purely conceptual aspects or to the most apparently ostensive terms. Thus, Humboldt warns, quote 10, "Even in the case of pure sense objects, the terms employed by different tongues are far from being true synonyms. And in using the word epos, ecus, or horse, we are not saying exactly the same thing. The same holds a fortiori for non-sense objects." Ultimately, then, if we may re-embark in our nautical metaphor, we will have to recognize that these transcendental conceptions of language do not admit the idea of transporting a stable meaning between two shores. And the same conclusion would be obtained if we subscribe to and examine the consequences of many of the theories of signification in contemporary linguistics and philosophy of language, which have placed further stumbling blocks in the way of the idea of translation as a stable semantic transferal. We need only think, for instance, of the commonly accepted idea following Saussure of differential signification, determined by the totality of language as a system of differences, where conserving the same meaning from one language to another would entail the transfer of the entire structure of differences producing it, that is, grafting the complete structure of one language onto another. So, to finish, to the first of our pending questions into which the seeming paradox of the impossibility and necessity of translation was broken down, namely the question of what is betrayed or impossible in translation, the answer would be the possession and transferal of an intact, plain meaning. In other words, literary translation would first and foremost be a sui generis experience and knowledge of the limits and differences between languages, but also, and this is going to be seen later, of the possibility of circumventing these limits and the effects that ensue where they are breached. As Blanchot has summarized, this is quote 15 in page 3 of the handout. Blanchot says, every translator lives by the difference of tongues. Every translation is grounded on that difference, even if it ostensibly pursues the perverse design to abolishing it. In truth, translation is in no way intended to remove the difference, upon which indeed it plays, alluding constantly to it, dissimulating it, but sometimes revealing and emphasizing it. It is the very life of difference, there it finds its august duty, its fascination. Experience in poetic translation, opening up to the experience of the foreign literary work and tongue, would create the recognition that languages relate to one another not through identity or universality of representation, but through irreducible differences for which creative forms of intermediation need to be found. As Benjamin also puts it, quote 16, translation is the transposition from one language to another, via a continuity of transformations. Translation governs continuous spaces of transformation and not abstract regions of equality. The translator's knowledge, then, would be first and foremost a knowledge of the differences between tongues, but then of the potential for creating new differences that allow one tongue to be expressed within the other. And secondly, if we are to give credence to the transcendental conceptions seen, that is, human beings as inhabitants of their language, this knowledge about differences and relationships between tongues would also be a knowledge about differences and relationships in the constitution of subjectivities, cultures, and experience, that is, of all the entities that inhabit and take form in language. Thank you. That's what I had to say for thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just going to faff with the technology a bit. My starting point is kind of the opposite of Andres's. So, where shall I go? My starting point is that language is a continuum. There are no given boundaries between languages. And in literary theory, I guess that's thought of as a Derridean point, but it's also a fact of language history and sociolinguistics. What we loosely call languages have developed over time. They've split, they've intermingled. Each one is internally striated into different usages associated with different groups, regions, professions, age groups, sexual identities, and so on. Every point on this continuum of language variety is always changing. What people call dialects are wholly continuous with what people call languages. The only reasons for the distinction are socio-political. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy, as the well-known and true saying goes, and one could make the same point about any typological word that separates one kind of language from the rest of the continuum of language by which it is surrounded and permeated. A dialect is a variety that, well, basically just a variety that someone has decided to call a dialect, and so on. Languages are not separate from one another. They're not distinct objects that you can count. And yet, translation exists. And translation seems to rely on there being separation between languages of exactly the kind that I've just rejected. How can that be? Languages are not countable, and yet if you ask the internet, it tells you that there are exactly 7,111 languages in the world. How can that be? As we'll see by the end of this talk, those two questions have the same answer. So I want to explore how translation, I want to think about translation not as operating between already given languages, but as operating within the continuum of language. And I'll start from some assertions which I'll go on to flesh out. The idea that languages are separate does not precede translation. It comes into being simultaneously with the perception of the need for translation. So it's not that languages were first of all separated and then translation comes along to bridge the gap. Rather, translation participated in the processes by which areas in the continuum of language came to be thought of and experienced as separate from one another. The idea of equivalence of meaning does not precede translation either. It too comes into being simultaneously with translation. So it's not the case that there were all along equivalences between the so-called separate languages and then translation came along and discovered them. Rather, translation created equivalences and imposed them on the languages concerned. Translation separates languages, and by that very same act, it creates the possibility of equivalence, the idea of equivalence. It's only once languages have been separated that you can think of there being possible equivalences of meaning between them. So let's look at an example. So this is round about the year 1700. A poet of what was then and is now called the English language, John Dryden, was reading some poems by another poet of what is called the English language, Geoffrey Chaucer, who of course lived about 300 years earlier. And it struck Dryden that Chaucer's poems needed translating. And when he's talking about this, he says, first of all, that they need translating into modern English. And then in the course of his discussion of it, that modern drops away. He says, what I'm doing is translating these poems into English. And at that moment, a border opens up between his language and Chaucer's language. The words written by Chaucer seem to Dryden to need translating. And because they need translating, they can't be allowed to count as English anymore. The idea comes into being that if they were English, they wouldn't need translating. It seems kind of obvious, really. The reason is not only that the language has changed over time, but also that Dryden thinks it has become better, more pure, he says, more correct. Those are his words. This newly standardized, newly homogeneous English that he himself is helping to establish by this act of translation, of course, has to have a barrier around it. Otherwise, it couldn't remain correct or pure. And translation polices that barrier. Notice how translation brings into being a particular conception of language here. Because Chaucer's poems need translating, they can't be in English. And correspondingly, what it is to be in English is defined as not needing to be translated. The creation of a border around the language across which translation has to happen goes along with the creation of a space within that border within which translation is assumed not to be necessary. So what we can see here is language separation and language standardization both at work together. Where you have standardization, you have separation, and vice versa. Let's look at another example. This time from the 19th century, and it's in Dickens's novel Oliver Twist. This is an illustration from about 20 or 30 years after the novel came out. It's kind of 1870s illustration. And what you've got here is the Artful Dodger there and Oliver there. So you'll remember that Oliver, a nice boy who speaks politely in correct standard English, falls into company with the criminal Fagin and his gang of young pickpockets, including the Artful Dodger. And this is Oliver meeting the Artful for the first time. So since Fagin and the Artful Dodger and the other kids form their own underworld community, they have their own language, words like beak for magistrate, jug for prison, wipes for handkerchiefs, and so on. And you remember Oliver kind of falls in with this gang and spends time with them. But amazingly, he never uses any of their words, though he's in physical proximity with them. He maintains a distinction between his language and theirs. And that's because he doesn't want to think of himself as joining in that community and sharing in their activities. There is one moment where he could turn this distinction of language use within English into a more solid barrier by translating, just as Dryden does when he translates Chaucer. But Oliver chooses not to. So what we got here is the Artful Dodger talking to another one of the kids, and they're talking about Oliver, and they're saying it's a pity he's not a prig. And the Artful Dodger turns to Oliver and says, I suppose you don't even know what a prig is. And Oliver replies, I think I know that. It's a You're one, are you not? So why doesn't he go through with the act of translation here? Why does he not say prig means thief? Because he senses that it would be too conflictual, too dangerous. To introduce an act of translation here would separate off their languages and impose a relationship of equivalence, which the Artful Dodger would want to reject. Because for the Artful Dodger, being a prig is something glorious, brave, and free. It's quite different from being a thief, that is, someone who deserves to be condemned and imprisoned. I think this is a really good example of the codependence of translation, language separation, and the idea of equivalence. So long as Oliver does not translate prig into thief, those two terms can coexist as different words in the same language with different uses and connotations. But if translation happens, this variety becomes configured as separateness, so a structure of equivalence can be imposed. Now, Lydia Liu has written at length, and really interestingly, about similar processes in the relationship between English and Chinese. So this is just more along the lines of what I've been saying. The trope of equivalence between the English word self and the Chinese, these words I don't know how to pronounce, yiwo, ziwo, and other words, has been established only recently in the process of translation and fixed by means of modern bilingual dictionaries. And then there's a recommendation for how we should think about this. Perhaps the thing to do is go beyond the deconstructionist stage of trying to prove that equivalents do not exist and look instead into their manner of becoming. For it is the making of hypothetical equivalences that enables the modus operandi of translation and its politics. For instance, historically, when and how do equivalents or tropes of equivalence get established between languages? And actually what happens later on in Oliver Twist is that the Artful Dodger gets arrested, he gets tried, and this equivalence that has been avoided in that moment I was talking about, you know, the definition of him as a thief rather than a prig, gets imposed on him by the court of law later on in the novel. So that's one really kind of stark instance of the imposition of an equivalence. Here's another instance of hypothetical equivalences being established and of the modus operandi. It's a horrible photo, isn't it? The modus operandi of translation and its politics. So this is in the aftermath of the genocidal war in ex-Yugoslavia, when a peace agreement, the Dayton Accord, had to be signed by representatives of the newly formed nation states. Because this was an international agreement, each participating state had to have a version translated into its own language. But this was problematic for the translators because these areas on the continuum of language variation, as they had been before this moment, had not hitherto been separated and standardized, especially not the kinds of language use that we're about to start counting as the Bosnian national language. So the translators had to create standard Bosnian in the process of translation and establish its differences from what counted as Serbian and Croatian, so that at this moment they could say, look, here is the treaty in 4 different national language versions, the other one being American. This process of the separation, standardization, and alignment of languages so that translation can be done smoothly between them is taken to its extreme in international organizations such as the United Nations or the European Parliament and in multinational businesses. What goes along with that is the exclusion of everything non-standard, of languages deemed non-official, dialects, varieties, idioms, idiosyncrasies, creativity. Those international structures are the channels of efficient communication in which machine translation plays an ever-increasing role. Now, I call that way of doing and thinking about translation, in which languages are separated and lined up into a structure of equivalences, I call that translation rigidly conceived. David Gramling calls it translational monolingualization. And he's got this really useful distinction between that kind of multiple language use and the more human, varied, and creative kind, in which language is conceived as a continuum of variation and each voice is allowed its own distinctiveness. So he uses a word derived from Halliday, glossodiversity, for the efficient alignment of languages conceived as being separate. And he uses semiodiversity for the flourishing of language variety wherever that happens, whether it happens in everyday conversation and wordplay, just as much as in literature. Okay, so the very idea that languages are separate and can be counted points in the direction of Gramling's translational monolingualization. Which brings me back to the 7,111 languages. When you ask the internet how many languages there are in the world, you soon arrive at this website, Ethnologue, which boasts of being the most authoritative resource on world languages, trusted by academics and Fortune 500 companies alike. So I love that. Ethnologue tells you how many languages there are. 7,111. But what counts as a recognized language? You click on the link and it takes you to the people who decide. Look, there's even an International Standards Organization code for a recognized language, ISO 6393. I mean, before I saw this, I thought international standards were just about the dimensions of fire escapes, you know, the construction of electrical plugs, all that kind of thing. You get an international standards mark. But here there's an international standards mark for whether it's really a language or not. You know, here I'm speaking, am I really speaking something that counts as a language? I have to go to this website to find out. But what is this organization, SIL, that has the power to grant or refuse ISO 639/3 to decide whether the sounds you make, the shapes you write, count as a language? And this is who they are. It's a missionary organization dedicated to supporting the translation of Christian scripture. So, and this is continuous with, you know, that enterprise of translation of the Bible that goes right back into the 19th century and the 18th century. So this organization, SIL, does do some reputable linguistic work. It records threatened kinds of language use. It promotes literacy. And its definition, there's a definition on the website of what kind of thing should count as a language. That definition is not in itself unreasonable. It includes a mixture of formal and social and cultural and historical factors. But the driver of this process of definition, does this area of the continuum of language use count as a language? What drives that is, do we need to translate the Bible into it? If SIL thinks it needs Christian scripture translating into it, it's a language. And if they don't, it's not. So this is a really amazing and massive instance of translation creating language difference and participating in the separation and regimentation of languages. For me, the challenge of translation, both of practicing it and of thinking about it, is not to take for granted the existence of separate languages, but to see how translation goes to work within the continuum of language variety. Translation can bridge difference, it can play with language, it can be individual and inventive, and in the second part of this session, there are going to be papers that explore that side of it. But it is also complicit in creating the difference that it then overcomes and imposing the regulation of language, which in its more imaginative forms, it also challenges. So I think the overriding challenge among our challenges of translation is to work out how to navigate those paradoxes. Thank you. Right, we thought we'd have a sort of brief 5 or 10 minutes for questions about this area, and a kind of breather, and then go on to the 3 more papers after that. I mean, the point, so what struck me with Andres is, one of the many things that struck me with Andres' points and examples was Humboldt involved in a particular nationalist moment of thinking about the German language, and so creating it as a thing, so that you could then sort of, as a sort of medium for thinking in, that was thereby becoming distinguished from the rest of language around it. And that was sort of clearest point of contact, I thought, between our 2 sets of material that we were looking at.
Yeah, what is interesting is that this transcendental position of language is Kantian philosophy and has many contradictions in Humboldt that in time you can unfold them. I insisted, because I knew that what he was going to do, I insisted in the more like orthodox version of it. Actually, I couldn't agree more with what you said. And actually, the transcendental position of language gets you there, because what is the Copernican revolution, what tells you is that form is or actually behavior is the formal condition of possibility of representation, of objectivation. And language is a representation, it's a concept. I mean, language is like a noumenical state in which you have to cut and define what a language is. It's a concept. And to create that concept, you need form. Previously, there's a form that has to be the formal condition of possibility to create that concept of a language. And the form here is translation. I mean, it's a form as performance, if you want. So I think that this transcendental, I mean, once you abandon that particular moment in German thought with Schleiermacher, Humboldt, Herder, and other thinkers, and you take this moved of a priori form that defines representation, it gets you where you are, where translation becomes the performance, the behavior that allows you to represent a language. So it's not that far in the end. I insisted in the more classical view so that they would match. But I agree with what you said. I mean, I couldn't agree more precisely from that point of view.
So this was both talks raise a lot of interesting questions, and I think one thing that Okay, can you hear me?
Great. And I particularly appreciate, Matthew, the challenge you put forward, that translation also creates this idea of, in creating this idea of equivalence, is also creating this idea of difference. But I did notice that in both of your talks, you're sort of drawing your examples primarily from Western European texts. And Matthew, you were looking also at particularly English, what we would call broadly English language sources. And I think there, the idea of disrupting a continuum of a language that has become increasingly hegemonic on a global scale is really important. But it still raises the question of if there's a difference between seeing language as a continuum across languages, or are we talking specifically within language, disrupting the idea of a continuum from, say, Old English to contemporary English, Old Hebrew to modern Hebrew. But also with Andres, the examples you draw have a very, I think, European idea of translation. I think the idea of transport is not something that all languages share in their conception of translation. So I think part of the thing that I'm interested in is sort of how we're framing this around sort of the languages that we know, the languages that, like, our own comfort zone in terms of thinking about translation, and being also cognizant that outside of our shared script worlds, there might be other ways of thinking about translation that don't rely on equivalence and transport. and offer instead metaphors that maybe actually help us think more about translation in terms of a disruption.
No, I agree. I mean, it's a limitation I regret, that I only know the languages that I know. What I think, so my sense of it, and this is just through collaboration with scholars working in India or scholars working with Korean literature within the Chinese script world, etc., is that what you can see by looking at those contexts is, okay, the way in which the idea of transport and equivalence, so our kind of standard idea of translation, comes into being as part of a whole set of ways of thinking and of thinking about language and technologies for using language. So there's a great, so for instance, Naoki Sakai, I don't know if you know his work. So a theorist, so he's got a book called On Japan in inverted commas and cultural nationalism. And that's one of the things that shows is that as the idea of Japanese as a language comes into being, he says during the 18th, 19th centuries, I forget the details of it, that's on a Western model. I mean, so that's so just as nationalist state construction, you get the same kind of pattern that repeats. So the idea of what it is to be a language gets established on a Western model. And at that moment, the whole set of assumptions about translation as transfer, the possibility of equivalence, etc., comes into being at that moment. And what goes along with that also is the dominance of writing as a technology and also print. Because when you've got print, you've got the possibility of identical copies, and that becomes a kind of visual image of the possibility of equivalence. So I mean, what I think, I agree. So what I think, and we'll say a bit in later talks, I think, is that actually I really don't know. I don't know what it. So part of me wants to say, okay, let's just ditch this whole idea of equivalence, because really, obviously, what happens in communication is there's never any equivalence. There's just a kind of rough collaborative construction of a usable degree of kind of sharedness in communication. Nobody ever, understands what's in somebody else's head. Nobody ever gets the same meaning of anything. So really what we've got is a much more fluid, kind of fluid process of collaborative variable meaning making. And we really need to ditch this whole idea of equivalence and learn from the other, words, tarjuma, etc., the words for rewriting rewriting in ways that are more relaxed about the idea of getting someone's meaning and more open to the remaking of it through rewriting. On the other hand, I'm not. I do also. So part of me is going in that direction. On the other hand, I think it's really hard to get away from the idea of understanding. It's really hard for me anyway to get away from the idea of understanding something. And it's really hard for me to get away from the idea of being able to say, I see what you mean, or I'm really getting the meaning of this text, etc. It's really hard to ditch that. So I'm kind of stuck in that perplexity really at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, considering what you were saying about the use of European translation, the idea was precisely to put forward the traditional conception of translation, to challenge it. And the first, I said, there was only the first question for the time being. What fails in translation? What's the impossibility there? And precisely once we get to the second question, what really happens in translation, the idea is to bring into the conversation all these other conceptions of translation, and especially also not only the concepts of what different languages, the word for translation in different languages, let's say Chinese or Indo-European language, American, pre-Columbian languages would tell us, but also what really happens. I mean, what happens when you see the actual translations of poetry. I think that's just a caveat, because the idea was to bring forward and question the traditional position, and that we are questioning now is the idea that translation can be transport, equivalence, or imitation of meaning. Then I think that what is important also to see is that the fact that you cannot identify an exact limit between two languages doesn't mean that you don't have two languages. I would disagree there, in the sense that you might not be able to identify the limit between, let's say, blue and purple, in the spectrum. There's a moment, where's the limit? I mean, it's impossible. But you can know that there's a concept for blue and a concept for purple. So I think the paradox, one of the paradoxes you said, like, let's think the paradox. One of the paradox of the difference between languages, which is a paradox that exists normally in the concept of limit as such, is that limits can be difficult to cross because they put like a stumble block that you cannot just pass. I mean, it's a limit that you bump into it. But limits can be difficult to cross because you don't know when you're crossing them. I mean, it's very difficult to point where it is. But I would disagree with the fact that the limit cannot be identified, that doesn't mean that you don't have differences. Because this difference, but I would agree with you that the difference is constituted a posteriori. I mean, it's a difference that is created by the performance itself of translation. But it's created. And obviously that limit is movable. It's in play. I mean, it is not fixed, so it can change its position according to the way you practice translation. Sorry. Yeah.
Great. I'm conscious of time, unless it's quick, because I feel there'll be lots more time for discussion at the end. I just feel I don't know. What do you think?
I think we should maybe move the.
Is that okay? Could you save
forward.
them? So sorry. Could we save those questions for the larger discussion at the end, because we've got 3 more papers to hear. Yeah, that's fine, Adriana. Of course, we started late anyway, so we're running a little bit late.
A general advice. Because we are the same people all the time, we're not going to a conference next door, so don't worry about time, because we can move together. We can there are sessions that are shorter, so we can shorten the coffee time or lengthen the coffee time. So don't worry about, worry about like sticking to the time you need to speak, but don't worry about if we are late 10 minutes, because we're all together, so it doesn't matter if we start 10 minutes later or 10 minutes early.
Great. Adriana, I think it's... Do you want to come here? Yeah. Okay,
so I'm going to just get started so that we can have as much time as possible for discussion. So now we're moving into sort of the kind of case studies portion of this session. I've titled this talk, and I'm trying to... I have it on my screen, so I'm going to be like twisted in a weird way. But anyway, I've titled this talk The Catastrophe of Translation, after the Canadian poet Anne Carson, who writes in her essay, Variations on the Right to Remain Silent, and I quote, "Most of us, given a choice between chaos and naming, between catastrophe and cliché, would choose naming." And that's the end of the quote. Carson doesn't finish the formulation, but we can follow her logic and finish it ourselves. Given a choice between chaos and naming, we would choose naming. Given a choice between catastrophe and cliché, we would choose cliché. A cliché, if we go by its dictionary meaning, is a phrase or opinion that is overused and betrays a lack of original thought. And this comes more from the French cliché, to stereotype. And to seal. So catastrophe, on the other hand, is a disaster, a cataclysm, a ruin, a tragedy. It comes to us from the 16th century, where it refers to a dramatic denouement, from the Latin, which comes from the Greek, katastrophe, which further breaks down into kata, down, and strophe, turning. The turn in catastrophe persists in its modern usage, where catastrophes are understood to be sudden, a break from the order of things, a disruption that often comes about suddenly, as opposed to cliches, which are predictable. This is a bit like the tremor some of us felt yesterday at noon. Carson writes that catastrophe is, and I quote, "a method organized by the rage against cliché. After all, what else is one's own language but a gigantic cacophonous cliché? Nothing has not been said before. The templates are set. Adam long ago named all the creatures. Reality is captured." End quote. In the poem that I will read now, the late 20th century Israeli poet Chezi Leskli even imagined cliches as a kind of language, the language of Eden. And I'm actually going to read this poem in Hebrew and then in English. I won't do this for every time that I'm reading a Hebrew text, because otherwise my presentations will be like an hour long. But this is a short one, so I'll read it for you first in the Hebrew, just so you can get a feel for it. And I'll scroll it down as I go along. בראשית הייתה קלישאה נהדרת שלא ביקשה דבר כי אם להכריז על עצמה. והקלישאה הייתה לבשר, והבשר היה לצמיד מבהיל, סביב פרק ידו של המתחזה לאלוהים, והיד חפרה מנהרה בעולם שממנו ביקשה להימלט. באמצע הבית הצבנו כיסא, באמצע הכיסא הנחנו תפוח, מה עושים עם כיסא ומה עם תפוח? שאלנו את עצמנו, וכך נברא סימן השאלה. נשקנו לכיסא ונסגנו בתפוח ואמרנו אמן. ברוכות השפתיים השורקות במנהרה, את המנגינת השיר שהעזנו לסתור. ברוכות השפתיים הנצמדות לתפוח, נצמדות בכוח לתפוח, שבדמיוננו המלבלב, ומפחד כמו תפוח. Okay, then I'll read it in the English. This is my translation. In the beginning was a lovely cliché that asked for nothing more but to declare itself. And the cliché was made flesh, and flesh was made a ghastly bracelet around the wrist of the divine pretender. And the hand dug a tunnel through the very world it wanted to escape. And we made the tunnel a house. In the middle of the house we placed a chair. In the middle of the chair we put an apple. What do you do with a chair and an apple? We asked ourselves, and that's how the question mark was made. We kissed the chair and nibbled the apple. We nibbled the apple and said, Amen. Blessed are the lips in the tunnel, whistling a tune we dare to contradict. Blessed are the lips wrapped around the apple, tightly wrapped around the apple of our budding imagination that gets scared like an apple. And now I'll try to make sense of this poem. In this poem, Leslie proposes an account of the origin of poetic language that simultaneously reworks the first lines of the book of Genesis and the Gospel of John. But by invoking the cliché as the first word of creation, Leslie complicates the very idea of originality. Clichés, after all, are words whose meaning and value has been emptied out by overuse. However, years earlier, the Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik credited poets with the ability to revive and reanimate the cliché, to breathe new life into it and bring it back into circulation. In his 1915 essay, Gilui v'kisui balashon, Revealment and Concealment in Language, Bialik offers this meditation on the origins of poetic language, and I've put it up so you can follow. Words writhe in their hands, in the poet's hands. They are extinguished and lit again. By this process, there takes place in the material of language exchanges of posts and locations. One mark, a change in the point of one idea, and the old world shines with a new light. The Hebrew poet Leah Goldberg also drew attention to the cliché in a 1964 essay on translation, which she actually wrote in English, where she traces the translation of the Petrarchan trope fire and ice across a number of poems. Here, Goldberg observes that the freshness that the cliché displays in a new language suggests in her words that, and I quote, "It was not a stereotype before as to lose all original beauty or meaning," end quote. On the contrary, the multiple translations that it generates testify to the translatability of the original as a renewable source. In Genesis 3, we are told that despite God's command that they not eat the fruit of the tree, it's mipri ha'etz in Hebrew, it later became an apple, Eve, cajoled by the serpent, takes a bite, and from that moment suddenly she perceives her reality fully. In fact, the Hebrew tells us she sees her nakedness. Biting the apple was the first human catastrophe, but it was the fate of the apple, or this fruit, to become a cliché as an oft-invoked trope of knowledge, transgression, beauty, poison, and more. Leslie's poem catastrophizes the apple, renaming it as it morphs from one image to another, as the poem itself morphs from a myth to a Jewish prayer. In this way, the cliché of the apple is renewed. Such acts of rewriting and translating assert this mobility of language, which is necessary for its survival. In Bialik's words, long-established words are constantly being pulled out of their settings, as it were, and they exchange places with one another. For Bialik, this mobility ensures that the barrier between a word and the void of language remains intact. Without this, a word would collapse into itself like a dying star, at which point the recovery of meaning would become impossible. For Goldberg, translation confers this mobility. For Leslie, this mobility can be asserted within language through compositional strategies like juxtaposition, for example, by placing an apple on a chair and contemplating it, or by rewriting, like giving it a different origin story. Anne Carson's Knox is a work of catastrophe, the catastrophe of a brother's death, which is reactivated through the catastrophe of translation and the brutal practices to which Carson subjects the poem in and through translation in order to keep it and her brother from completing the passage across the void of translation. Published in 2009, Knox, which I have here in front of me, opens with a poem by the Latin poet Gaius Valerius Catullus, who was active in the 1st century before the Common Era. The poem, an elegy addressed to Catullus's late brother, opens with the line, multas per gentes et multa per aequora vectus, carried through many nations and many seas. Catullus is referring here to the journey he has undertaken to reach the ashes that remain of his brother. But Carson, who is mourning the death of her own brother, also uses this poem as a way of thinking about translation, about the many nations and many seas through which a translation circulates to reach a destination that in the end is broken, fragmented, and incomplete. In the essay being translated, Susan Sontag observes the following relation between translation, life, and death. She writes, originally, at least in English, translation was about the biggest difference of all, that between being alive and being dead. To translate is, etymologically, to transfer, to remove, to displace. To what end? In order to be rescued from death, from extinction, end quote. If there is a word that we're getting at, if there is a brother on the other side of the translation, Carson throws up various obstacles and distractions to keep us from getting there. Remaining in the process of translation is the third option that Carson proposes in Variations, as a kind of middle course between catastrophe and cliché. Because once you've reached the other side, you are no longer in the process of translation. The translation is finished. The brother is dead. The book itself is enclosed in a box that recalls a crypt or a coffin. Looks kind of like this. Okay. In an interview with the radio producer Jim Fleming, Carson proposes the following ways of reading Knox, and I quote, "Yes, you can unfold it on your kitchen floor, or better thing to do if you have a multi-story house is to go to the top of a stairway and drop it down, because it unfurls at page by page, and it makes this wonderful crackly sound as it unfurls." And I can confirm that this is true. In fact, the spine of Knox, I'll show you, produces a crack as loud as a chiropractic adjustment when it hits the ground at a certain angle. But the book is remarkably sturdy and can withstand this damage. I know this because my son once flung it across the room of our apartment. The book unfurled in the air as Carson promised, but it also twisted up like an errant slinky as it landed, and as a result, there are several pages in my copy that will never bend along their original seam. Carson's suggestion is often taken as an example of her dry sense of humor, her seeming lack of attachment to the book, but reading a book in this fashion is also catastrophic. On the page behind me, Carson writes, "My brother's widow tells me that when she first met him, Amsterdam, he was penniless. He walked into the bar and she looked up and said, 'That one I want to marry.' They lived for 2 years on the street, sleeping in stairwells, eating once a week. And this further prompts a memory of her brother as a child, huddling in a stairwell with a bleeding face. But note the etching that cuts through this page, evoking a stairwell, but also the shape of this book when it unfurls its pages. As Sherry Simon has noted about Carson's translation practices, and I quote, "For Carson, the line between languages is a fold among others, and translation activates something of its original meaning, the line between life and death. And Carson's translative writing reminds us of this farthest border. We are directed to the place where the shadow's edge joins the black of night, reminded always that surfaces have seams, an underlife. At the edge of Knox, we find this page." Oh, that's the Sherry Simon quote, sorry. Oh no, where's my, it's missing my final page, so I'll show it to you. And this final page recalls actually the opening page of the book, which begins with Catullus's poem in Latin, but somewhat blurred. You won't be able to see it, but you can come later and look. So on this final page, we can faintly make out the words in English and surmise that this is a translation of the poem, and possibly Carson's translation. She has given us throughout Knox the tools for translating Catullus 101, but in the end, she does not give us the final translation, or she does, but we can't read it. "He refuses. He is in the stairwell. He disappears," she writes just before we reach this page, just before she leaves us in the end like the brother, illegible, catastrophic, and untranslated. Thank you. And
hello, everyone. I've brought only 4 handouts. I wanted to be environmentally friendly, and I thought we wouldn't be sitting in this UN meeting format. So perhaps I'll just pass on to here. because you don't need to read the handouts. It's just for your, so that you get a sense of what these poems look like. So it's about the construction of these poems rather than actually reading through them, because reading through all these translation multiples might be quite a painful exercise. So the title of this session is Untranslating, and I thought I can approach this idea of untranslating with relation to translation multiples in two ways. So translation multiples, which I'm going to talk about, is what I think is this new genre of writing, which came into being over the past, 3-4 decades. It's usually about one original which gets translated multiple ways, multiple different ways. So one passage, one poem, and then kind of resides in these either conceptual books made of different translations of one particular original, or sometimes different poems. So for example, in your handout, the first page is Caroline Bergwall's Via, which multiplies translations of the original 3 lines of Inferno. So you see that this poem is entirely constructed only from translations. So this idea of translation multiples, I think, was first signaled by Rebecca Wolkowitz in her epilogue to Born Translated, if you've heard of this book. In that epilogue, she's saying that translation multiples are possible. So these ways of multiplying different originals are possible now thanks to this shift, technological shift, and just because there are no shipping costs and there are no production costs. If you have digital publishing, it's more, for example, in online journals as well, it's possible to produce several variants of one original just because it's, it is still time consuming, but less cost effective. And in her, so she's attributing this shift to this, so the kind of like, the emergence of translation multiples to this technological shift. Whereas most of these examples I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to show you actually were, they came into being in print. So they were produced in print a few decades ago. And some of them you might be familiar with because, for example, 19 Ways of Looking at One Way, as Adriana put it, has become even a cliche of translation multiplicity. And for example, the beginning of Via, when I discuss this poem with a few people, they usually say, oh, everyone just knows in the middle of your life, blah, blah, blah. But actually, everyone keeps humming this song, this tune, without knowing the original lyrics. So in a sense, in English, it has become a sort of cliche as well. But when it comes to this idea of untranslating, I'm thinking about it in two ways. So first of all, these translation multiples show the process of translation. So the fact that one poem gets translated so many different times. And actually, this always happens. So the thing is, when you approach a poem, when you approach a literary work, quite often translators have those different ideas how to render it. But then at the end of the day, they need to come up with this ready-to-read version, which is quite often commissioned by publishers. And some of the other variants are, for example, sidelined and they are pushed to the footnotes. And in academic publishing, it's a regular practice. So some of us working in modern languages, we always have this idea that, probably there is no equivalence or no equivalent version. And then we are unhappy with just one particular term. And then we, for example, place different terms after slashes, in brackets, in footnotes, and so on. So in academic publishing, it is pretty common. But it is not for some reason in literary translations because there are different expectations as what to count as literary translation that works and acts on its own. So in this way, I think these translators want to show that there is still some process or some procedural poetics that goes behind the scenes. So you can take one poem, translate it multiple times, and still display this array, this multiplicity in the text. And the other thing is that some of these translation multiples, they act on their own. So they become very interesting poems in their own right. And I think the tension between what these poems consist of, so the fact that they consist of multiple translation, is sort of neutralized by the fact that they start telling different stories in their own right. So the fact that something is multiplied becomes a new narrative, and I'm going to show you in what way. So most of these translation multiples, which were published in English, they multiply, works which are either very familiar, like for example, as I mentioned, Dante's Inferno, the opening of Dante's Inferno, 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei might be familiar to American readers because it was one of the first translation multiples published in the US. Then I'm going to talk a bit about Douglas Hofstadter's Le Tombeau de Marot, which is a book consisting of 88 different translations of one poem of a Renaissance poet, Clement Marot. And then I think Matthew was going to talk about Anne Carson's, a fragment of Ibicus translated 6 ways in the next session, or unless you decided to drop it. Okay, great. But it's still in your handout. Yeah. But first of all, before I'm going to talk about these translation multiples, I'm going to show you a few translation multiples where the visual aspect of translation multiplicity is quite important. So, for example, the Uruguayan artist based in New York, Alejandro Cesarco, decided to display 10 different translations of one page of Inferno, and then he called this work Dante, untitled Dante/Calvino. And this work was exhibited during the Guggenheim, as part of the Guggenheim Lost in Translation exhibition in New York. And those 10 different translations, he decided to place next to each other and then give each of them a chapter from Calvino's If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. So a work in itself, very postmodern work, but also kind of stressing the presence of the active reader. And in this respect, I think Cesarco wanted to stress this idea that we as readers, as viewers of these translation multiples are also activated readers of Dante, and translators are activated readers of Dante. And also he's known for works which focus on something we usually skip. So for example, he had a different exhibition called Index, where he just placed different indices of non-existent books, imaginary books, or a work on footnotes, so just displaying footnotes without the original content. And in a sense, he kind of focuses on the things we usually we normally are not interested in, we would skip while reading the books. And I guess no one really reads translation multiples as such as well, just because I think most of the readers don't read translations just for the pleasure, for the pleasure as well. But if you read one translation after another, then in a sense you get this multiple viewing of one work, whereas most of readers take one translation and are happy with one version of one original text. And in this particular case, Cesarco is kind of saying that we should also, just like we skip footnotes or we skip indices, we should also read translations as a multiplied process, which also can be pleasant in its own way. Then, for example, Rosemary Waldrop published a kind of collaborative translation multiple of Ernst Jandl's visual poetry, which itself enters those series and different linear arrangements. So in a sense, the fact that we can see translation multiples in those turnable pages, in those linear arrangements, becomes a concrete poetry in its own right. So we see that the multiplicity sort of played out in those turnable pages, arrangements, and it creates series as well. So these are different multiple visual ways of approaching multiples. In the same way, there's also an interesting ongoing tradition, especially in Canadian, North American English language tradition, of multiplying one frog, haiku of Matsuo Basho. Quite often it's quoted in Blythe's translation, "The old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of the water." And most of these translations, so for example, 100 Frogs, published by Hiroaki Sato, or different Canadian poems kind of experimenting with this one particular poem, they also enter those interesting visual relations in those poems, in the translation multiples. But what is quite interesting for me in this case is that the kind of multiplicity of these frogs already plays into this tension between the singular, plural, and plural, which is already found in the original, because actually, when we look at the original, the Japanese kawazu, frog, can be either in plural or singular. So the fact that we have plural frogs actually reinstates some of the problems we find already with the original. Also, the fact that haiku originally was part of a longer form called renga, And here we see those different chains, those like water ripples after this frog jumped in. So we see those footnotes of different versions or multiples of the original haiku. In a sense, comments on the fact that originally haiku was also a longer form, and this is how it got marketed and how it is read in the English tradition. And finally, translation multiples in the case of Basho, they also remind us that the original haiku was actually created in a collaborative act. So it was the frog haiku was created in the frog contest. So it was a collaboration of the crowd of authors who decided to compete and produce different poems on frogs. And this is how actually original Matsuo Basho's poem came into being. One of these, what I'm also interested in the case of Basho is the fact that most of these versions are called variations. So the idea of literary variation, which itself is a genre of writing. So the idea that you have different variations on a theme of something, which comes from music. But one of Hiroaki Sato's examples is called 10 Variations on a Theme on the Frog Haiku. And I emailed Hiroaki Sato because actually he places those 10 variations, but there are only 3. And I was quite surprised because the title itself is 10 Variations. And I wanted to know whether he himself collected or edited just 3 out of 10. And he said that the original author, William Matheson, he just decided to take 3 out of 10 because this is a literary device itself, because this is a genre of writing where you have this idea that only 3 out of 10 variations are available, and just because Basho is open to our interpretations, we can write our own versions. So this is what I found out, but I'm not sure whether that's his interpretation or not. But this idea of variation on a theme probably rings a bell for those of you who are also familiar with the French tradition of Oulipo, because Raymond Queneau also had this idea of writing different variations on a theme. So his exercises of style were 99 different narratives or different ways of rendering the original accident on the bus, and then this concept of having different narrators kind of filtering the original narrative, and actually us having no access to the original, also quite important in understanding how translation multiples work, because they also filter the original through those different narrative perspectives, like different translators approach the same original from different interpretative, ideological, cultural angles as well. And now I'm going to just quickly tell you about 19 Ways of Looking at One Way. It's on the handout as well. And those of you who are Spanish speakers might be interested in seeing the Spanish versions as well, which are, one of them is created by Octavio Paz, who's also in that volume, but also Hilario Fernandez Long is, I think, one of the versions. So he himself also came up with 2 different versions of this poem. So the original poem, which probably is something, the deer alongside the deer park, or the form of the deer enclosure, so different ways already of rendering the original title. In that particular book was rendered 19 different ways, and the title of Elliot Weinberger's book refers to this idea of cubist representations, which are familiar from 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird in Wallace Stevens. So we already see this original poem, which is going to be viewed from different perspectives. And actually, the poem itself, if we look at those different translations, we see how, for example, some of the translators imagine the moss, which is in that poem, very short poem, as growing somewhere on the top of the trees, or maybe on the top of a stone, or like someone is viewing the moss from a different perspective, and so on. And we also see that in some of these poems, if you look at the handout, some translators decide to say "I hear" or "something is heard." So we already see how the positioning of the narrator, or the positioning of the translator, is quite important in seeing the one way in those different ways. And also the title is quite strange, because you have this repetition of 19 ways, and you have 19 different one ways. So in a sense, Octavio Paz at one point is saying that it was Ezra Pound who created Chinese poetry in English, and here Wang Wei also has, I think, become part of English poetry, just thanks to, first of all, Elliot Weinberger, but also Wei has become this one way just in sound. So the Chinese and English can merge thanks to those different translations in this translation multiple. Are you showing me that I'm running out of time? Okay, good. Great. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about Caroline Bergval's Via. Has anyone heard of Via before? Because I'm not sure how many. Okay, good, great. I'm going to talk a bit about Via, and then I'm going to talk. I'm going to tell you also about my translation of Via, which was a controversial project, I guess, in its own way. So Bergval compiled 47 different versions of Via. Of the original three opening lines of Inferno. Those of you who have the handout can see that the first version reads, "Along the journey of our life, halfway, I found myself in a dark woods wherein the straight road no longer lay." And this particular passage in different translations is reiterated 47 different times. And the title is 48, and I always wondered why would the title be different from the actual number? And we see that Bergval, first of all, she kind of like reshuffled different versions of this poem herself. So at the beginning you have the audio version, which she recorded, which is now available at Pen Sound. Then she published 48, then 47, then 36. So in a sense, she herself kind of manipulates with those different versions. But in this particular one, I feel those of you, if you remember this funny puzzle with a triangle, so we have like different triangles, and in the middle there are like a few other triangles, and the kind of point of this riddle is to tell the number of triangles you see, and then everyone just forgets the big one. So I feel like this poem works in a similar way. So in a sense, we have those 47 different versions, but the 48th one is actually the whole act of juxtaposing Dante's variation. So it's her own personal variation on Dante as well. It's quite interesting that she also wanted to reenact this academic gesture of going to the archives, looking in the British Library for those. She found 200 different translations of Dante, so of Inferno, the first canto. So it's quite remarkable that this would be such an important work. But also, the way this poem is constructed is that you have those three different lines, then the name of the translator and the year of publication. And I think maybe, I'm not sure whether she was familiar with that particular publication, but in 1957, Dante Society published something which was quite similar. So in a sense, they published a list of available translations in the same way, but published chronologically. And I feel like Bergval was sort of hijacking and creatively kind of reworking this academic act of compiling, different translations, squirreling, and then going to the archives and kind of like ferreting out those different versions. And she decided to kind of reinvent this poem not by putting these versions chronologically, but alphabetically. So if you see, those of you can see it in the handout, it starts with an A, along the journey, then the next one is at the midpoint and halfway. So it starts, so the versions are arranged alphabetically. And I think this particular conceit has to do with the fact that Bergval thinks of this act as not an academic way of compiling or producing some sort of, books or anthologies, which would be academic compilations or tracing the history of reception, but in her own reading, this act of via, like the life path, kind of leads via language. So we also see via and via get intertwined alongside, across two languages. But also, it's quite remarkable that this particular passage gets repeated so many different times, but so many different people at different points in time, and each of them says, I've got lost, I couldn't find the right way. And each of these translators admit to having lost the same, to being lost in their lives, one after another. So maybe this progression actually tells us something about humanity, the fact that although we've gone all this way, we keep losing the right side, we keep losing the right way. And this happens just across the time, across language, and everyone admits to not seeing the right way. And actually the right way maybe doesn't exist, because if we look at these translations, some of the translators call it the right way. The way is narrow, is direct, so actually referring to the shape. Then some of these translators said, I lost the true way, the truthful way. So there are some moral undertones as well. Then for some of them, the path was straightforward, or the road extended on miles. So we see how like those different ways, those different ideas of what's right, what's correct, what's straight, and so on, it also changes. So maybe actually the sense of getting lost is in language. It kind of stays in translation. It kind of originates in language. So you might ask why someone would translate this poem into a different language, and I translated this poem into Polish, which is my native tongue. There are only 21 different versions of this particular passage in Polish. One of them was lost during the war. The other one had a missing like first page and so on, but I ended up with like 21. But then was quite, I think, unique, and John Cayley wrote about it, from Brown, wrote about it in his article in the translation of process, is that I added my own translator's signature. So I ended that whole succession with my own translation. And there are three things I wanted to say about this choice, because it was quite controversial, I guess. So I added my own version, first of all, because I wanted to mark this way that I'm sort of like contributing to this path. So I'm commenting on the process as well, just like Bergvall came up with 48 different Dante variations. So she compiled the whole poem, and she treated it as a personal act of compiling those different variations. And I added my translator's signature there. Another thing is that I needed to start with a Z to make sure that my translation is at the end, which cost me a lot of effort and gymnastics and linguistic acrobatics, but it worked. Then another thing which probably might be familiar to those of you who work with either Slavic languages or maybe in French, it's also the same. So some of the past forms have gender markers. So this particular poem in English works just because when I say I got lost, it doesn't matter whether it's Dante speaking or the the narrator of this poem, or whether it is Seamus Heaney who translated this poem. So the kind of idea here is that there is some sort of kind of appropriation of these words. And that doesn't work in Polish, which has, in particular in the past, but also in French, je suis allé, you would have the E, for example, at the end and so on. So it doesn't work in languages which have a gender specification. So I just decided to, and actually there were two female translators of Dante, and I just decided to leave it like that to kind of show the history of how women need to speak with those male voices over time, but then add my own translation which had feminine forms to kind of show that this perhaps has changed, and this is my commentary on the way it's been done before. And finally, just a minor point is that I just decided to modernize. So my translation is quite modern compared to others, because what I really like about the English translations is that there's this kind of genre of experimenting with Dante as well. There are a lot of translations which are published, which are either look sort of avant-garde or just sound very modern and very interesting. That's not the case in Polish. Cool. And because of that, I just decided to add my own modern take on Dante. I just seen I'm running out of time. Great. So I wanted to just like wrap it up and open the floor for discussion later. You're going to see some other examples in my handout. If you have any comments on the Spanish versions, I would be quite interested to hear about the Spanish wangues. But in general, in this case, what is quite important for translation multiples as a kind of separate genre of writing is that translators no longer remain behind the scenes, because all the kind of procedural poetics is exposed. And I guess this conference is all about celebrating that. So looking forward to the rest of it. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. Now I have Patrick.
Yep.
I feel we started about 20 minutes late, and I feel this session, Patrick's going to finish talking at 11, so I feel we can take 20 minutes for discussion after the end and push the start of the next session back a little bit. Is that okay?
The next session is only 8 minutes, not
Yeah.
20. So we start the next session,
Yeah.
let's say it's 90, let's put it a bit longer.
Yeah.
We start at 12, the next
Yeah.
session.
find your.
Given the construction thing, it's quite important. We have
How do we get to the? Do you know?
Where is it? So I was going to talk about translating the unfinished, and then it occurred to me that the particular unfinished that I was going to focus on was also unbegun. It's obvious to you, of course, that in order to translate something that's not finished, the translator has to make decisions about what the note or the poem or the draft would eventually have become. And that involves, I think, making decisions that the poem itself hasn't made, and that perhaps the author themselves couldn't bring themselves to make. And I thought that I would use as an example of that a book called Pour un tombeau d'Anatole by Mallarmé. You might have come across it. It's not really a book. It's a series of notes that Mallarmé had written for the death of his son. So we're thinking as well about the difference between a tombeau and an elegy. And it occurred to me that the tombeau is an entombment. It's a burial. It's a form of closure. The reason Mallarmé can't write this quite harrowing poem, which exists here in parallel text in my version, is that, to use the analogy that Yeats uses about closure, he says that finishing a poem is like closing the door on the box that you have made. Mallarmé talks about writing poetry as climbing into the coffin that you have built for yourself. And when his 8-year-old son died, Mallarmé planned or projected a poem which was going to be the Tombeau d'Anatole, which, as we've heard today, the tombeau has a very special prestige in French. That is to say, it's a tomb made out of words. It's a form of closure. In that sense, it's different from elegy, which is a set of totally different, I think, emotional propositions. Anyway, I translated this about 20 years ago, at a time when I didn't have my own children, because I would have found it extremely difficult to translate were I a parent at the time. How did I finish Mallarmé's poem? Well, I didn't. I translated it, but I had to find a kind of unfinishedness that worked in English, because it's very natural to want to complete things. We heard earlier about the cliché, about the forms of reassurance that closure gives us, which at some level we perhaps reject. Intellectually, of course, because we're all clever people, we reject closure. It's one way of telling ourselves and each other that we're clever. But emotionally, we need closure because it's a way of remaining sane and calm and inhabiting the cliché that is stability and that allows us to function. And form, whether it's a poem or a life, is really only visible once it is closed. Until then, it's really form in suspension. So what does one do with the unfinished? So I translated Mallarmé's notes, and there are strange notes because he starts writing the poem while his son is still alive, ill. Can you imagine the sort of internal torture, the guilt? You know, the poet needs to write. The father, of course, wants to keep his son alive. So already you can see the ways in which this poem could simply never come into being. And before I go into it, I thought I would take a look at a couple of quotations about tombs and about fragments and about elegies. So the first one, which touches a little bit on some of the things we've seen emanating from Anne Carson, is this, I think, very good statement. Greek lyric is mere fragments. We act, speak and write as if pious bishops, careless monks, hungry mice had not consigned Sappho and her lyrical colleagues to irremediable oblivion. We do not want to admit the fact of this loss, so we open the fragments and try to read poems that are not there. This is not prevarication or trickery, this is human nature. We want those poems, and in unguarded moments, we imagine them back into existence. I think that's a lovely piece of academic writing. It's full of feeling as well as an understanding of why we go for the complete, why we need the answer, why we want to make the fragmented or the broken whole. A rather different proposition is one that I don't really agree with, and I've put it here because I don't agree with it, though like a lot of things that one disagrees with, it's got a kind of neatness and clarity that I thought we could put under pressure for the remaining amount of time I have. Bad elegies. This is Susan Eisenberg. It's a great book, but I disagree with this. She calls Wordsworth and Coleridge's elegies bad elegies because they refuse to confront the moment of death or the fact of the body. The dead are not allowed to return in any shape. Now, I kind of feel that not confronting the death or the fact of the body could also be a very good elegy. And I want to try to explore this in the time I have. This rather sad picture is the tomb of Mallarmé, where he was preceded by his son, Anatole. It's actually rather a shattering picture if you think about how, and in the fragments here, Mallarmé talks about how the death of his son, who is the youngest member of the family, causes them to buy a plot in the cemetery. And he begins at the top on this kind of pillar of deaths. Anatole, Stéphane, Marie, the mother, Geneviève. I just put that there because I thought it was important to do something that Mallarmé does in this poem, which is confront the materiality of the place where the body goes. So this isn't a set of abstract ideas about what happens to the spirit, what happens to the body. It's not a series of abstract sort of religious or metaphysical consolations. It's poetry, the things that make poetry get written, that is to say, the intellectual mind plus words, confronting blocks of things, blocks of, bereavement, stone, a hole in the ground. And Mallarmé begins writing his tombeau for Anatole while Anatole is ill. And he is constantly looking forward as in the sense of ahead to the time when Anatole will die and the poem might be complete. And you can understand why Mallarmé actually never finished it. So here is a little piece of the manuscript for you. Now, these sheets of paper on which Mallarmé wrote these notes, and you can see how they're written, yeah? Proper fragments. We don't even know if we can call these towards a poem. Mallarmé didn't give it a name. Jacques Scherrer called it pour un tombeau d'Anatole, that is for or towards. I'll show you the size of the sheets of paper. They were these. Yeah? Very different kinds of objects on which this putative elegy stroke tombeau might have been written. I'm just going to look at a couple of extracts and think about the sorts of issues they might throw up for a translator, as well as a human being who's trying to work out why something simply cannot be written, even by someone who is an expert in death, like Mallarmé. If we think of another great Mallarmé elegy, the elegy for Paul Verlaine, where he talks about death as un peu profond ruisseau calomnié par la mort, just a little narrow stream, it's nothing. Whereas in this, he's trying to use all of the resources that his poetic tradition has given him to console himself about his son's death, but they don't work for basic reasons I don't need to go into. But there's an extraordinary moment where he is trying the ultimate cliche. He's moving the cliche, of course, that we all need as well, where he says, you haven't gone. changement de mode d'être, c'est tout. It's just a change of mode of being, that's all. Of course it's not. And so this poem, is this unfinished or is it unbegun? I suppose that's the question. Did it ever start? It's not a poem. Paul Auster's translations use... Oh, I'll just show you one other thing. This is devastatingly sad. I couldn't find a way of doing it. But I want us to look at... you see, the whole drama is in this. Malade au printemps, mort en automne. C'est le soleil, la vague, idée, l'atout. Ah. Fils résorbé, pas parti. He's been resorbed, not gone. It's him or his brother. I told him this. 2 brothers. Refoulé, resté en flanc. He is imagining, going back to Eve and the apple earlier, he is imagining his son as coming from his own flank. And the poem also contains a really shocking, quite disturbing psychodrama about the mother and father. The mother is talking about how the son that she bore is going to die, and she's not interested in the metaphysical schemes for consolation, the metaphysical literary schemes for a possible tombeau, for the poem. She doesn't want that, and there are moments in these fragments where she says to the father, Mallarmé, I don't want him gone. I don't want you to have him. I don't want you to write the poem about him. And there's a struggle which comes to a head as they are taking the body to the tomb, which we've just seen. Fureur contre l'informe, fury against the formless. And you get Mallarmé, this sense, the anger, the fury. What is the formless? Is it death? Is it the formlessness of our response to death? Would a response to death be the right response if it was form in the first place? All of these things seem to be being asked in that specially interesting way, which means that they don't get answered. Anyway, I translated this fragment, this whole book of fragments, and you can see the kinds of things that he is trying to do. Jacques Scherrer, who's the first editor, transcribed them, but he gave them a kind of poeticness, which they don't have. And in 1998, Bertrand Marchal brought them out as the notes that they actually are. When Jacques Scherrer's edition came out, it was translated by Paul Auster, who respected the spacing, even though the spacing was essentially random. Remember, bits of paper like this. And Auster treats it, it's a good translation, and Auster has obviously been profoundly moved by it, but he treats it as a finished poem in the tradition of American poetry of the 60s and 70s, that is to say, Creeley, sort of post-Olson poetry. And so the spatialization, which in Mallarmé is random, becomes in Auster's version, which I didn't put up, this is mine. But why did I do it like this? It was because when I started translating the Mallarmé, I started translating it because I was frustrated at Auster's inaccuracies. And while I was translating it, but following the Jacques Scherrer alignment, the new edition came out, which do I have examples? You'll see, anyway, this is all really distressing, but I can tell you more about it if you want. Okay, so this is what the new edition finally comes out as. These are the fragments as they come out in the Pléiade edition. So they're not thought of as poetically aligned. It might not be a poem. It probably isn't. Doesn't mean it can't become a poem. But as a poem, perhaps, it was never begun, whereas a set of literary negotiations with death, it very definitely was begun, but never finished. So the edition of the French is that, and this is a key moment in the drama, in the psychodrama, where the father is having a discussion with death before death comes to take his son. Everyone else has been pushed aside. The son is there, the mother is there, it's death and the father. And in my head, what Mallarmé is imagining, and I don't even know if he's imagining it as a poem, is death saying to him how he is going to come and take his son, but how somehow it's not, there's a softness to it. Death, you can either treat it as the friend or the enemy. And I found this was the bit that most struck me, because everything else was broken and hard and rubbly, and you could cut yourself on these fragments. They were so sharp. You could cut yourself, emotionally, it was quite harrowing. But this seemed to me to be a moment in the poem where a conception, something was being reached for. And I don't know, I found it incredibly powerful. This is my literal translation of it. And this is the version of it that I produced and put into my own book of poems. So, there are some ethical issues there, but I'm not interested in discussing them. But I found this was such an important set of mental configurations for me that I, with almost no violence to the original argument, I've used every single one of Mallarmé's words, but I've turned it into a poem. The only edition I could find that I had with me was from the Italian version of my own selected poems. So now it works as one of my own poems, though it's very clear in the original edition that I've taken it from Mallarmé. Can you face me reading it, and then I'll stop? So, La mort chuchote tout bas. Death whispers softly. I am no one, I do not even know myself. The dead do not know they are dead, nor even that they are dying. Children, at least, or heroes, the sudden deaths. My beauty is made up of last moments, lucidity, a face, the beauty of what would be me without me. For as soon as I am, that one dies, I cease to be. Thus am I made of forebodings, intuitions, supreme shudders. I am not except in idea. As for the others, for the living, their tears, their mourning, etc., that's just my shadow clothing them in black. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Kasia, would you like to come and so now we have a nice stretch of time for conversation. Now we have a nice stretch of time for conversation and discussion. Let's try and make it not so much a sort of question and answer session as a kind of shared conversational thing in which people are reacting to each other's comments rather than just asking us stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. The presentations were wonderful. Do you hear me through this? Okay. I do have questions, particularly for Matthew and Andres, just because I'm curious that despite the differences that you two have shared in your presentations, I'm curious about things. Yes, there is fluidity. Yes, there is continuum. Yes, there is difference. But how can there be an agreement, the minimal agreement, if we do not fix meaning at some point? And then as soon as you fix meaning, you have the standardization, you have the normativity. So my question to both of you is, how do you do that? I mean, how do you reach any kind of an agreement without necessarily doing violence, or even if that's possible?
Yeah, well, do you want to? What I think is, I think we need to think of language practices in particular circumstances with people sharing modes of behavior and being able to do certain kinds of things, establish certain kinds of sharedness with the practices that they're participating in. So I'll say a bit more about this this afternoon, but so for instance, the kind of context that we're in now, it's not enough just to say, okay, we're all using a kind of international English. We're using a particularly regimented kind of academic international English in order to achieve certain kinds of sharedness that count as, the thing we do in an academic context like this. But we could be using language completely differently. We could be singing, we could be communicating, we could be behaving linguistically in ways, using words that don't really have sort of the kinds of meanings that our words in this context take on in the way in which we're using them. We could be communicating in a nonsense way, in a way that was very emotionally suggestive, but not at all communicative of propositional content. And that would be a different language practice. So for me, for thinking about this kind of thing, it's good to get away from saying, there are languages, and instead to think about groups participating in language practices. I mean, like, so for instance, my Spanish is rubbish, but I can still just about read Andres's book.
Because my book is rubbish.
No, but because...
It's a sharedness.
Which is obviously the opposite of the truth. But I mean, because the convergences between the French and Italian, which are languages that I know, and Spanish are there, and that helps, but also because the kind of discourse that it is a discourse in which I also participate. Whereas my kids, I remember, this is lovely, so one of my kids who's 5 or 6, already a fluent speaker of English, so-called, a native English speaker, picked up one of my academic books and started trying to read it. He said, "Daddy, is this written in Latin?" And that shows that those are the kinds of things I think it's important to think about practices and the assumptions that are in the practices and how we use the practices and what we attribute to what we produce by those practices.
Yeah, very short. I mean, two things about the question you made. I think in the first is that meaning being complex and being fluid and being difficult to translate. I mean, to recreate how the behavior of language in one side, you might not have the same attitude, the same possibilities in other language, or very different ways of working. You can the fact that you cannot reproduce the same meaning doesn't mean that obviously that meaning doesn't exist. But meaning, I think, even in one language, because also, I mean, we have been speaking about translation in a very normal way, like between languages, but translation also applies to systems of signs, like let's say music to oral language or between the arts, and also inside a language. We are all speaking English here, but we all have very different Englishes here. And for many of us, it's not our main language. So it's also, you have to, the fact that meaning is complex and is fluid doesn't mean that you can avoid choosing and stabilizing it at a moment. So I would say you have to always make of this fluidity a decision permanently. A translation is also about that. It's about making decisions all the time, although these decisions are not absolute. You cannot defend them in absolute terms. And that's like it's a kind of ethical part of translation you can never avoid. No translation would be good if you could avoid that moment of decision. Then machines could do them better than we do them, because it would be just about applying rules. And this is not about applying rules, it's about taking decisions and being responsible for the decisions you take. And decisions might change in time. So that would be one part of the answer. The other part of the answer, which I think I forgot now, it's that when you communicate meaning, but you communicate it in a way that you communicate behavior before of meaning. So what I'm giving you is signs. It's a behavior. It's a phonic behavior at the time being. It could be written, or it could be a different kind of sign, which is a behavior that you have to reconstruct. And it depends on your expectations and the way you are used to applying the rules to that phonic system, the way the meaning is going to raise in you. So obviously we do share to a certain extent the same ways of interpreting behavior, but not all of them. So meaning, that's why it's never too stable between even two persons that are speaking the same language. I'm giving you a phonic behavior that you are transforming into some kind of representation. But the rules through which you do that, they're never the same in two persons. And I think that going backwards, you have to be also responsible not only for what you say or what you understand, but for the way you have create this personal systems of rules of interpretation of the materiality of languages, which give you these behaviors which you have to transform into meaning, inside your head or whatever it is. That's the way I would put it. Sorry.
Okay. I have a footnote to Andres's presentation that happens to resonate with Patrick's remarks, and it's about the role of form. I was interested in seeing you re-invoking the traditional association of beauty with pleasure. Now, recent work in the neurosciences and in evolutionary biology has interestingly emphasized that beauty in a way had a huge role in survival, adaptation for survival. And that in a way, it confirms your whole argument about the role and the importance of form, but it gives it even a scientific grounding. And when I think about Patrick's very moving presentation at the end, you invoked all the issues, the untranslatable, why something simply can't be written, and almost like consolation as cliche, but the untranslatable is a cliche in itself and has been a cliche, especially in relation on Holocaust literature and so on. But it seemed to me what really mattered, especially when you read the last poem, is form itself as a consolation, the creation not of a content that gives you consolation or a facing of this, but the transformation. Literature becomes a transformational object, the transformation of the pain into form is itself an affirmation of life. And so in a way, their beauty comes back into it. It was a very beautiful poem, and the way you read it. So that it's not so much a question, but a footnote.
Well, thank you. Yes. I mean, what I did there, of course, was, I suppose, finish more or less where I started, which is to say that I made a decision that those words had not made themselves. If Mallarmé had wanted to write this, he would have done it, and he would have done it brilliantly. And we don't know what format he might have done it in, but he didn't do it. I decided that it needed to be a poem because I felt that it was sufficiently whole to contain a poem. But it's very much not his poem, though the words are his. The words are his, but the whole idea that it might have become a poem is mine. And one of the things I was going to look at, but didn't have time to look at, is about the particular status of a word that crops up a lot in the Mallarmé poem Encore, which in French can denote both once again and still. It can denote return after interruption or continuity. And where Mallarmé frequently says, il vit encore, il me parle encore, il est encore là. The encore contains both things. He is still here, that is to say he's not dead, or he is come back once more. English doesn't do that. So at each point, I was having to decide whether to use still or again, once more or continuously. So I was making very clearly decisions that the poem wasn't making. And actually, by deciding on behalf of the language that Mallarmé used, I was, I think, changing the poem. Because that is also, it boils down to the way in which we deal with bereavement and death and memory. Do we see it as a return, that is to say, they die and they come back, or do we see it as continuity, which is that they might die, but at some level they haven't died? All that is in the word encore, but not in still or again. You have to choose.
Could I ask what the kind of constraint that made you feel you had to choose? Because you could say still again, or you could say, okay, here's something I can't put in standard, in dictionary English, so I'm going to stretch English a bit. So something made you feel you didn't want to do that. You had to choose, you say.
Yeah.
So something made you feel you weren't prepared to stretch English at that point.
That's
and
right,
innovate.
Yeah.
You wanted to lodge it in already existing English.
Yes, and there must have been reasons, but each time, and in fact, I even needed to do what all translators feel they need to do, even if they don't do it, which is justify why they did what they did. Yeah, if you notice that, there's always a note on the translation. I did this. And that, of course, is a way of recognizing the pressure points in your own system, if it is a system, and not making an excuse, but explaining why you did what you did. In this context, I made decisions about what it was, but what I didn't want to do was to... I thought that there wasn't a way of doing it in English. I must have thought that. But also I was trying to be very, very faithful to the brokenness of it, partly as an antidote to Paul Auster's very fluent, but I think not correct approach to it. And I don't just mean not correct in terms of the words he uses, but I suspect that Osler didn't read the Scherer translation where Scherer says, you know, I have put these on the page in this way in order to give you a material sense of what the fragment looks like, rather than because Mallarmé was wanting to write like Charles Olson. And anyway, I think I was trying to correct something. Don't know why anymore.
Whereas, John, when Anne Carson is faced with the Latin equivalent of encore, she opens up all the various things it can mean in English each time, doesn't she?
Right. So the thing I couldn't pack into the 15 minutes is that what she does is throughout the book she weaves together fragments of letters from her brother, images from their family photo album. But also throughout, she unpacks every single word of the Latin, and she offers a kind of gloss. It's a sort of almost, because I studied Latin in high school, so I remember this. The dictionary would give you the word and all the different possibilities in English and pulling examples of how it's used in a sentence. So in effect, in that way, she turns the reader into a translator if one wishes to assemble it. And so, but without actually putting it together for us in the end as something whole. And the way I read that is that the translation as an end product is the closure that clever people want to avoid. And so instead of sealing it off and saying the brother is dead, the translation is finished, we're just left with this sort of suspension of words that it's up to us to sort of put together. But then in a sense, giving us as readers and potential translators putting us in the position of, in a sense, burying the brother all over again every single time. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add something about the example I didn't manage to discuss, which was Le Tombeau de Marot. So again, in this particular case, when, as Douglas Hofstadter decided to translate the same poem 88 times, he was dealing with, his wife's sort of sickness and then death, because she was diagnosed with brain tumor. And the last two translations, which are quite interesting, are done by him, dedicated to her, because the poem's title is To a Sick Damsel. So in a sense, this has become also an interesting investment in the project, because as the project developed, he realized it will be also kind of a memorial not only to Clément Marot, but actually also to his wife. And the last poem, the last version, 88th version, which runs off the whole series, is done by the wife on the deathbed, and is also like a reply to Marot. So in a sense, for him, because he's also interested, he previously won the Pulitzer Prize for a different book, which also kind of investigates this idea of form in different arts. So in music, mathematics, and illustration and graphics. In that particular case, for him also form and this repetition of 88 different times, or kind of different afterlives in Benjamin's sense of this original poem, also become a way of like preserving something, or a way of, dealing with bereavement, but also kind of thinking that there's some hope that in that extended chain we are actually going to preserve something which is in the original as well. So the form will outlive the original matrix in a sense. So.
And just a little footnote, the wife's translation, so Carol's translation,
which is in your handouts.
It features in a bookmark
right.
that was part of the hardback edition. So in fact, while you're reading the book, you can be marking your spot throughout with the wife's translation. So I have a picture of it, I'll show it to you.
I think that in this thing of the multiplicity of translations, something that was very patent and interesting is not only the fact, let's say via, the last example you gave, not only the fact that you added your own translation, but the fact that you have here variations in which the order in which you put them create a certain expectation. It's like a fugue in music, or variations in music, in which is not only the fact that you can multiply translation, but the fact that the way you put them in a series, the previous translation already forms an expectation in the reader for which she reads the next translation. So there's also a kind of building of meaning and an authorship that goes beyond your having put your own translation, but the fact that you ordered them in certain ways. Like each of these translations is like a word that you put in a sentence. And the way you form that sentence with all these blocks of...
And the fact that I didn't translate my last translation from Italian, I actually translated them all from the previous version. So in a sense, there's also this kind of combined kind of reservoir of meanings in a sense. So
Yeah, no, and I know that we are, but I think
No, it's fine, it's fine.
I'm sort of interested in what you are using, what the term meaning means, because by the focus on the poetry in the examples and so on, it seems so much, and then particularly with Patrick and Adriana, that the meaning is in the sort of carrying across of the affect, right, to a certain extent. So we're all terribly moved, right? How does that, and I'm not discounting that, right, but it's just a sort of, that it's affect actually that's being carried across, and so what is meaning, in the sense there, right? And I contrast that then with or perhaps juxtapose it with Matthew's great SIL initiative with the biblical stuff, where the meaning is actually has a different kind of metaphysical heft, if you will, right? And so and we can say what we want to say about something that's established in 1934, and that's so there's a politics involved in that versus the affective description of meaning. And I'm not saying that's what you guys intended, but there seemed to be a pattern pulling out that when we have poetry as the master example of translation, something's happening, whereas if we have sacred texts, something else might be happening. So that's why I'm just interested in what meaning means.
Yeah, well, very, very briefly, in the Mallarmé, I mean, what interested me about the poem is that all of Mallarmé's other poems about death are not actually about affect. They're about playing an intellectual game where you beat death because you're a writer. He can't do this for obvious reasons, but it struck me that the overall conflict, father versus son, poet versus son, child doesn't want to die, but poet is thinking about the poem. Father doesn't want his son to die. Father is in conflict with himself as poet in the mother. The ultimate conflict is between intellectual explanations and the different kinds of circumstances which are affect, where they stop working. When Mallarmé is writing about his friends who are poets, he writes absolutely perfect intellectual constructions, which are very philosophically sophisticated about death. He can't do it here.
So the intellectual recuperation to a certain extent, right? Versus maybe the aesthetic, Kasia, in your case, where these multiple translations and the images of them. There's another recuperative kind of work going on there, I think, right? And I just find that a different kind of trying to lay hold of meaning than a sacred text that is trying to do something. In other words, that's why the privileging of poetry is a sort of an interesting thing on our path.
Poetry in the case of, if you think of sacred texts, I mean, poetry behaves in very different ways, and meaning. I wouldn't say that's a different idea of meaning in sacred texts than in poetry, but traditionally, because there's this respect for the letter of sacred texts, is the way like Heidegger reads poetry, unfortunately. He thinks it's a sacred text. It's all about etymology. Like he would have learned about rhythm or images or music or whatever. But yeah, sacred text normally, because you think that the words are absolute, you're searching etymologies and you're searching like to unfold a code. Whereas in poetry, there are very different ways of signifying. It might be music, images, might be context, irony, and language. We use it that way all the time, intonation, all that. So the problem is that obviously you cannot do in another language exactly the same. Then you get to Borges' tautological idea of meaning, that you have to repeat exactly the same words. But even then, it's not the same meaning because the new context activates a new meaning. So I would say, but I don't think that you have different conceptions of meaning. I think language always behaves. But then, let's say in philosophical discourse, there's a lot of behavior that eclipses itself towards a main behavior, which would be like the lexical syntax behavior of language. So it's a lexicon ordered by a syntax that dominates. Whereas if you have like a song, normally musical ways of signifying would be very prominent. Or if you have like Chinese poetry, you would have images that are very prominent, although music is present as well. Or if you have, let's say, Propertius or whatever, or Laforgue, or let's say Nicanor Parra, a Chilean poet, you would have contextual effects where meaning is activated to context. He's playing with the expectations of the public. So you have to translate differently when you activate those meaning. If let's say Nicanor Parra's cover of the complete works has an empty cross, that says in Spanish, voy y vuelvo, which literally means I go and come back. But that doesn't work in English because that's a typical thing that you put in a store when you leave for lunch. So if you translate it into English, you would have to, because it's a contextual effect that basically is a provocation and religion activated on the expectations of the people. To translate that, you cannot say, I go and come back. You'll have to pay maybe gone fishing or out for lunch.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And then if you translate it into indie culture, maybe you'll have to put the Buddha chair empty, not the cross, because no one would understand the cross. So, and that's a contextual effect, but that's very different from the way of translating, let's say, music, where you have to semantize the music of a new language in a way that reproduces the music effects in another language. So meaning, I think that you can have an holistic theory of meaning where you have various ingredients, and those ingredients eclipse or gain prominent according to the kind of discourse. But poetry, in poetry, meaning can act in many, many ways. I mean, they're very different poetry. There are musical poetry there. I mean, and also the taxonomies are quite unstable because you can use music to do irony, like Laforgue. He does lots of ridiculous rhyming to understate what he's saying. So he's using music to do irony. So also the taxonomies are fluid, but it's all about understanding what the protagonism of language in a certain text. As I say, in philosophy, it's not that language doesn't behave. It's just that it's conceptual. It's the conceptual side of language that gains prominence. It's the idea that, at least in classical philosophy, obviously there are philosophers that play more like Borges said that Heidegger had invented a German dialect. So it depends on the kind of philosophy also.
I just think in response to that, I don't like the word meaning very much, and I think it's helpful to think in terms of kind of practices and rituals and consequences. And so Jane, what your question makes me see newly is the kind of relation between religious ritual and practices and the practices and rituals of reading poetry, which is to say that what a mission, what any kind of propagation of a religion kind of endeavor is concerned to do is not only to translate text, but to inculcate people into rituals and practices, and modes of behavior. And similarly with poetry, there are things people do with poems. And so I think the question of kind of how is the text to be used, what are the kind of practices that it is designed to prompt, is always actually a really, really interesting question in relationship with translation. So that, for instance, if you think of a context where meaning, something called meaning is strongly defined and regulated, say in the translation of medical texts or say in the translation of legal texts in an international treaty. Well, in fact, what you've got in those circumstances is really, really strictly defined rituals and ways of using those texts and acting in response to them. So I think it's important to think about practice the whole time.
And I also want to add that I think this distinction between poetry and sacred texts is very
I meant to gloss that, but it's not a real distinction.
Right, okay. Yeah. But I just want to also bring in that when we're talking about sort of literality, I think this comes really very much from a sort of Christian theological perspective. In Judaism and Jewish textual tradition, the line between poetry and sacred text is so blurred. And in fact, if you read any sort of Talmudic exegesis, it's all about constantly troubling this idea of meaning. So for instance, you can imagine, I should have tried to bring some of this, but the whole discussion of how this fruit of the tree becomes an apple. And what is the fruit of the tree? What is it? It's just, they spend hours and days and months and years debating this. And the idea is not to come to an understanding or a consensus, but to constantly be generating ways of asking questions that are always unsettling the meaning of the text. And that's what I see Leslie doing. He's playing around with this idea of like, the New Testament idea of in the beginning, there was a word. He's like, no, actually in the beginning there was creation, there was making. There wasn't a thing that we call like a language or a word or an object. It was the act of creating is the beginning and bringing us back to that. So I appreciate it. I know you weren't trying to draw a line between them, but I think
it was interesting because it came on me when you were speaking, as you talked about poetic translate that in your remarks, and I heard poesis. Mm-hmm. I didn't hear literature, right? And so that's why. But then I began to think, but it's all not actually, poesis in that larger sense of thinking. But that's what made me think about it.
If I also wanted to could add something to that. So, first of all, when, for example, we look at multiple translation, there are some people who would, for example, think that some of the translations which were, for example, presented by me are not actual translations of these particular poems. And you think that, well, poetry is something which inherently is more creative, and people would think that, there can be multiple translations of this poem just because the poem lends itself to those translations. But at the same time, when we think of the history of translation, actually the Bible is the first translation multiple, isn't it? Just because there were so many different ideas about how to translate the sacred text. And it all started with Septuagint, which was the kind of reversal of that story, where you had all 70 different translators who came up with one equivalent version, which is, of course, something quite problematic. But on the other hand, all those major shifts actually in thinking about the text and the meaning actually came through, first the Reformation and then different translations. People had different ideas about how to translate that. And we kind of come to terms maybe more easily when we translate poetry, just because we think that translation of a poem is something already like inherently creative. But at the same time, people have different ideas about how to translate one particular phrase in multiple ways, regardless of whether it's poetry or the Bible. So
maybe we should. Let's stop and have our coffee break now. Thank you so much.
Let's come back. You can say that